Hello there! So we have gotten some feedback about spoiler warnings before these episodes, so just to let you know, this is an episode covering Masters of the Air, the new TV show streaming on Apple TV+. We will be covering all 5 episodes that have aired to this point. I have seen the entire series, so I may obliquely reference particular events or themes that recur throughout the show, but I will not cite specific instances or quote particular characters or reveal who dies or who doesn't at various points in the show past the 5th episode. We'll also be discussing the other 2 Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg produced World War II shows, that's Band of Brothers and The Pacific. We will be discussing or showing how those shows end. We're also briefly going to talk about some of the Oscar movies this year, including Oppenheimer, Killers of the Flower Moon, and The Zone of Interest, in the broadest possible terms, and, I guess, spoilers for the Second World War. With that in mind, let's jump right on in. In the 4th episode of Masters of the Air, Colonel Chick Harding considers the argument that his servicemen in the 100th Bomb Group might be traumatized by their experiences.
I told him war is war. The longer you go at it, the more it screws a man up.
Aerial combat like this hasn't been around since the cavemen, sir.
Well, of course not, Red. Every war has its novelty.
Masters of the Air is the 3rd in a trinity of miniseries produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks looking at the Second World War. While Band of Brothers followed the war in Europe and the Pacific focused on the island hopping towards Japan, Masters of the Air is about the industrialization of conflict during the Second World War. The technological innovations that allowed both sides to render destruction on a previously unimaginable scale. Powerful enemies must be outfought and outproduced, argued President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the wake of Pearl Harbor. We must outproduce them overwhelmingly, so that there can be no question of our ability to provide a crushing superiority of equipment in any theater of world war. During the country's 4 years of combat, American industrial production, already the most advanced in the world, doubled. It wasn't just production, it was innovation. According to Jeff Dufford, the curator of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, aircraft and weapons development advanced exponentially during World War II. Major advancements included jet engines, guided bombs, air-to-air and surface-to-air missiles, cruise missiles, radar, and operational helicopters. These technical innovations made warfare much more efficient and effective. This increased the destructive capacity of these armed forces. The United Nations estimates that some 60 million people died during the Second World War, almost 4 times the 16 million people estimated to have died during the First World War. Entire cities were reduced to rubble in 1,000-bomber raids. So if Band of Brothers was about Europe, and the Pacific was about Japan, then Masters of the Air is about this facet of the war, about the pilots and the officers who manned those machines, who planned and orchestrated those raids. There's a recurring sense in the show that the human body is incompatible with these technologies, that these bombers are not necessarily designed to be operated by human beings.
It is 25,000 feet and 50 below zero. The piss freezes against their skin.
Throughout Masters of the Air, characters become trapped within the metal architecture of their bombers. Some, like Colonel Curtis Biddick, played by Barry Keoghan, go down with their aircraft. Other crew members find themselves unable to escape in these panicked few moments, ending up snagged on broken metal or trapped in the plane's turrets. These aircraft are new and relatively untested. They're also temperamental, which is a horrific thought to contemplate when operating at these altitudes. On his first run, Major Gale Clevin, played by professional Elvis accent haver Austin Butler, laments that he didn't drop a single bomb. When preparing to take off, the crew have to manually pump to start the engines. The leader of the Red Meat Squadron has to turn around halfway to target due to a technical malfunction. At one point, Sergeant William Hinton explains that the crew cannot take off during fog because there might be a cow on the runway, and these industrial death machines really aren't designed to handle that.
Alice isn't a Buick, babyface. She's a tin can. If we go head-to-head with a cow, she'd accordion, with us in it.
This is a recurring motif on the show. When dealing with this level of industrial destruction and devastation, it's very easy to lose sight of the human element. The people who operate these machines are ultimately treated as expendable. It's a cold way to think about war as a series of competing industrial interests. Early during the war, the campaign focuses on factories and submarine pens, with a clear objective of denying the enemy the opportunity to industrialize to the same extent as the Allies have.
And no war machine moves without ball bearings.
However, as the war drags on, it becomes clear that enemy infrastructure does not exist in isolation. The nature of the bombing means that these attacks will kill dozens or hundreds of civilians. However, the cold logic at play is that these human beings are ultimately just resources that are feeding an enemy war machine. Major Harry Crosby, played by Anthony Boyle, is a navigator who suffers from air sickness. He guides his squadron from the back of the plane using charts and math, without even needing to look outside the window. It's all theory. Indeed, Crosby is eventually promoted past the point of needing to actually be on the plane at all, instead coordinating these larger bombing efforts from the group headquarters, even further away from the targets that will be hit by the bombs he's planning to drop. The pilots themselves can feel detached from the carnage that they cause, which creates an existential anxiety. Characters like Major John Egan, played by Callum Turner, proving that he's not just the boy in the boat, he can be the boy in all sorts of transportation, drop the bombs from their planes. Through the clouds, it's impossible to discern the people who will be killed by the explosion. It's an impersonal form of warfare, quite different from the immediate horrors depicted in Band of Brothers or the Pacific.
Never been on the business end of a bomb before.
The Allied bombing campaigns during the Second World War remain a source of controversy to this day. The bombing of Hamburg specifically targeted civilians. There's an ongoing debate about whether the bombing of Dresden should be considered a war crime. In the Pacific Theater, the firebombing of Tokyo is estimated to have killed 100,000 people in under 3 hours. Masters of the Air is understandably reluctant to approach these questions directly, but they haunt the miniseries. Of course, what will bring about the end of the war against Japan, and thus the end of the Second World War as a whole, is the culmination of this industrialization, the biggest bomb ever dropped. At the end of the war in Europe, the Allies would discover the true horrors of industrialized mass murder. The Holocaust was its own grotesque form of industrialized slaughter. Never before in history had people been killed on an assembly line basis, explained historian Roald Hilberg of the atrocity. Although these 3 shows, Band of Brothers, The Pacific, and Masters of the Air, are all about one conflict, they each speak to their particular moment. Band of Brothers was a product of the long 90s, a patriotic rallying cry to salute the greatest generation that resonated profoundly when it was broadcast in the immediate wake of 9/11. A decade later, The Pacific spoke to a fundamentally changed nation, one that had already lost a generation to horrific forever wars that were waged on a distant continent. Masters of the Air was produced during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the largest land war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. It will stream in the midst of the ongoing conflict in Gaza that has seen the highest daily death toll of any major 21st century war. While the Second World War was fought using pioneering aerial technology, these modern wars bring their own innovations: drones, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare divisions. Most of the world watches footage of these conflicts at a remove, on the evening news or streaming on social media. These atrocities are rendered abstract. They're mediated. We are kept at a distance from them. It feels notable that one of the big recurring motifs of this year's award season, most notably in Oppenheimer, Killers of the Flower Moon, or The Zone of Interest, is the way in which human beings can become detached from atrocities committed on that scale, whether by looking away, by lying to others, or even to themselves about their complicity, or simply by getting on with their lives in the midst of this horror. Focusing on the industrialization of killing on this scale, Masters of the Air captures that same sense of numbness, the fear that these mechanical forces only serve to dull empathy. There's little room for any humanity inside the bellies of these cold metal beasts, and that makes it easier to deny the humanity of those victims thousands of feet below. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.